the UK is already experiencing very significant impacts of climate change, and it has alternatives at its fingertips that it's now really investing in, renewable energy in particular, that can shift us away not just from volatile price spikes that hit consumers and households badly, but also make sure we're on a safe climate trajectory.
The UK's gas production is 45% of the UK's gas demand. That's not a negligible contribution. And certainly on our analysis, the amount of money that the UK saved by domestic gas versus imported last year was order of £2.5 billion. These are not small sums.
These companies insist that they get tax breaks that, despite this being a national non-renewable resource, allows them to continue to profit when people are really suffering with their energy bills.
I'm Dominic O'Connell, Times columnist and business correspondent on Times Radio.
And I'm Emma Powell, business journalist at The Times, standing in for Hannah Previtt today.
This is The Business, where we talk to insiders about markets, companies and survival strategies to help you navigate the business world. Our business today is the North Sea. A growing chorus of voices in recent days has been calling on the government to support more North Sea exploration. And it's not just the voices you would expect who want more drilling.
North Sea oil and gas production was down to just 1.1 million barrels a day last year, a quarter of what it was 25 years ago. The UK is now a net importer. The key question now is whether the government, having banged new licences as part of a net zero drive, should give the go-ahead for new exploration.
With us today, two people who have very different views on the future of the North Sea. Tessa Kahn, founder and executive director of Uplift, an organisation that campaigns against the production of fossil fuels here, and Chris Wheaton, an energy analyst with the investment bank Stifel. Nice to have you both here. Well, we'll talk to both of you in a minute, though. First, so Emma, you've actually been writing recently about the North Sea and the debate about the North Sea. Just explain, why is it so contentious right now? Yeah,
so oil and gas was first discovered in the North Sea in the 1960s. Production really ramped up in the 1970s. Heyday was the 1980s, and it's pretty much been all downhill from there. So a lot of the large oil majors have moved out. The smaller producers that say they are still interested in exploring, they say their appetite has really diminished, mainly because of the Windfall Tax that was introduced in 2022, of course, at the time of the last big energy crisis, the Russia-Ukraine war. And we've also had a ban on new licenses for oil and gas exploration and drilling. And we have two major decisions coming up from Ed Miliband in only a matter of weeks on Jackdaw and Rosebank, which were being developed by Shell and Equinor. What about you, Dom? So how far back does your reporting go?
Well, I hate to share my every week I'm showing my age, but I when I first came to the UK, I did an awful lot of reporting because I was working for a construction trade paper on Piper Alpha, the Piper Alpha disaster and the aftermath of that. For those who it happened before their time, Piper Alpha was a platform that caught fire and exploded, killed 165 workers and 2 rescue workers. And the aftermath of that completely changed the whole North Sea. And in the construction industry, in particular, the health and safety executive was made responsible for offshore safety for the first time. Before that, it had just been done by the Department of Energy. And it is, in those days, it is true the North Sea was part of the national consciousness. And you referred to how it was a big earner for the UK. In 84, I think it was 5% of GDP and 10% of all tax revenue came from the North Sea. It's a fraction of that now. And the other thing that I think people miss about the North Sea is that it did allow a big step down in the UK's CO2 emissions, because it allowed the replacement with gas of coal for domestic heating, for industrial heating, and for electricity generation. So I'd love someone to do the numbers on what the change from coal to gas did to the CO2 emissions of the UK. But it is back in the news now. And some pretty unlikely people have been speaking up in favour of more North Sea drilling.
Yeah, exactly. So we've had Tara Singh, who, of course, is the head of the trade body for the wind and solar and renewables industry. She said that it's entirely sensible that we continue to support domestic oil and gas production. We've also had Greg Jackson say that if it is available in the North Sea, then we should continue to use it rather than ship it.
He's the boss of that energy supplier Octopus, who has been on this podcast, I have to say.
Yes. And of course, Jürgen Meyer, chair of Great British Energy, who is very surprising coming out in support of North Sea oil and gas production. But ultimately, of course, the government has continued to say that the only way to reduce our exposure to these energy price spikes is to get off what they describe as this roller coaster, this fossil fuel roller coaster. Chris, can I ask you, you're with Stifel, the wealth management and investment banking firm. You've been in oil and gas for over 20 years. So how does exploration work in the North Sea and who is currently doing it?
Right, let me just do a quick explainer then on sort of kind of how the North Sea works. You get licenses, you explore for them. Actually, a lot of that exploration work is now well behind us because, to put in context, we've got 3 billion barrels of oil and gas actually going to be produced in the next 25 years to 2050. But there's another 4 billion barrels on top of that that's already been found that could be developed. So there's an awful lot of exploration activity already done. What happens then is you go through a licensing process, and that the government then approves those licenses, and then you then develop the field. That means it involves drilling wells. You might have a floating production platform or a fixed one. And then you produce the oil and gas. As I said, you pay taxes on that. As we said, currently with the Windfall Tax, the tax rate in the UK is 78%. That's versus 28% normal tax rate. And then eventually at the end of field life, you get decommissioning. And that's when the platform or the pipes and the wells on the seabed, they're all taken away. The government has a standard of, back to sea floor as the decommissioning standard, and the decommissioning is paid as a cost. Effectively, the government, what the companies do is pay higher tax up front, and then that then is paid to the government, and then the government then gives them some of that tax back as a rebate against the costs of decommissioning, because once the field's decommissioning, it's not generating any profits. So the government is taking that higher amount of tax it was paid before and then paying it back afterwards as decommissioning. So
you're in favour of more North Sea oil and gas production. Can you tell us why?
To me, the right solution for energy in the UK is an everything everywhere all at once strategy. And that you can't just rely on one source of energy for energy security purposes. And I think that's been brought into real focus by the events of the last month or so. And the issue for me is there is our analysis says a number of things. Firstly, imported LNG.
We should just explain what LNG is.
Sorry, that's a good point. Again, more acronyms, more three-letter acronyms. Right.
It's liquefied natural gas, which is brought to the UK on big tanker ships.
Yeah, if you want to bring gas imports into this country, it's more expensive than domestic gas, and it's also more sensitive to energy security issues. We started talking, at the beginning of the show about there being 20% of the world's global LNG supply is stuck behind the Strait of Hormuz at the moment. Secondly, you can bring, therefore, more LNG is going to bring overall average gas prices down. You produce, the Climate Change Commission itself says the UK is going to burn 12 billion BOE, that's barrels of oil equivalent. Sorry, I promised I wouldn't talk jargon. Barrels of oil equivalent by 2050. And that's on the net zero pathway. The North Sea can deliver 3 billion of that. With just what's already found, in addition to that, that number goes from 3 billion to about 6 billion. So that's not a change in the overall amount that's being burned, but that's an awful lot more that you can get from the UK. And every pound spent in the UK is a pound that supports jobs, generates tax, not just directly from the industry, but you've got up to 200,000 jobs supported by the industry across the country. You've got significant payroll, VAT taxes paid by the industry. And last year we spent 11 billion pounds importing gas from Norway, 5 billion pounds importing LNG, and the UK North Sea to produce both oil and gas spent about 10 or 11 billion pounds. So there's a significant amount of money that could stay in the UK and benefit the economy, benefit energy security, benefit energy affordability. To me, it seems common sense and part of the everywhere, the everything everywhere all above strategy, all at once strategy I talked about.
Tessa, let's bring you in. You're an environmental lawyer and you run Uplift, which you founded and which campaigns against more oil and gas production in the North Sea. Just explain why you don't want any more.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dom. So there are really a couple of clear reasons underpinning why we think it's really important to rapidly transition away from new oil and gas production in the North Sea. And just to be clear, we are very much in favour of continuing production from existing fields and licences. And that actually is the position of Tara Singh, Greg Jackson, Jürgen Meyer. They've clarified their comments in the last week to say what they are in favour of is continued production from existing sites, not new licensing, which is very much consistent with the UK government's position. But our principal concerns are this. The first is that more North Sea oil and gas drilling at this point will not contribute to energy affordability in the UK, which is the principal concern for households. It's what led people to spend tens of billions of pounds after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 and the wholesale gas price spiked. People's household energy bills went through the roof, and more North Sea gas drilling won't do anything, as the government and industry acknowledges, to bring bills down. We're also at the point, as Emma said, where we are well past the peak of productivity in the basin. It's an ultra-mature basin, and anything in terms of gas that's easy and economic to extract has already come out. There is vanishingly small amounts of gas left. Some recent analysis showed that 14 years of hundreds of licences being issued under the last government, dozens of new fields being consented, has led to the production of the equivalent of 36 days worth of annual gas demand in the UK. That's really the dwindling amounts that we're talking about. And the oil that remains is largely exported, so also doesn't contribute to domestic energy security. And then finally, from an energy security, energy affordability perspective, it's not an answer. And then, of course, there is the fact that the science is very clear. Experts like the International Energy Agency, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have made it clear that existing oil and gas supply globally, if burned, would take us past what everyone agrees, including our government, are safe climate limits. And the UK is already experiencing very significant impacts of climate change, and it has alternatives at its fingertips that it's now really investing in, renewable energy in particular, that can shift us away not just from volatile price spikes that hit consumers and households badly, but also make sure we're on a safe climate trajectory.
Chris, can I just pick you up on a point that Tessa made? Because I think one of the interesting things about energy prices is that they're only part of the cost of living, but all the political polling shows that they're the one thing that really get people excited. And we slightly saw that during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. People really react very strongly to the amount they pay for their energy bills. Absolutely. You think that having a UK active North Sea thing would give you some insurance against bills. It might not bring them down, but it might protect you a little bit from some of the big swings in bills.
It's going to limit your need to buy expensive LNG when times are liquefied natural gas when that's expensive. So it's going to bring down the risk of higher bills. Secondly, it's going to limit the amount of more expensive LNG you buy, and those are going to have an overall impact on the average cost of gas, which ultimately ends up in the consumer's part, what consumers pay for their gas and electricity. There's also other things I think the industry or the government can look at. So long-term fixed price contracts were the norm in the gas industry if you rewind 20, 30 years. Why can't we go back to those? There's still some contracts, like, for example, the Britannia field in the North Sea. It's still got a small fixed price contract that's like 55, 60 pence a therm, which is about 20% cheaper than gas prices were before this war broke out. So I think there's ways to look at not just the mix of gas, but also the prices you pay for gas and the long-term purchases you need. Because, as I said, the Climate Change Commission still think we need 12 billion BOE, barrels of oil equivalent, of oil and gas between now and 2050, even on a net zero pathway.
Tessa, I sense you disagree with some of this.
Well, I mean, I think what Chris hasn't said is that more domestic gas production from the North Sea will bring down people's energy bills. I think we actually agree on that it doesn't matter how much gas you get out of the North Sea.
Well, but to assert that, you need to know what the international price of gas is going to be.
Right.
And no one knows that.
No, but the amount that we produce here is so marginal that it's never going to affect the price that we ultimately pay, which is set regionally. So that I think is clear, that energy affordability in terms of households paying for a unit price of gas isn't affected by more domestic production. But just the other thing that I would say in terms of displacing our need for LNG imports, which is the point that Chris was making about kind of protecting us from the risk of volatile energy price swings, the way that we are currently actually displacing LNG imports is by our renewable energy. And actually there's analysis that shows that the amount of wind and solar that was secured in the latest auction round that the UK government held to secure multiple gigawatts of renewable energy, that will create the equivalent of displacing 78 tankers worth of LNG each year between now and 2030. Domestic gas production, as I said, is vanishingly small at this point. If you look at, for example, the independent regulator, the North Sea Transition Authority's own forecasts for how much difference new oil and gas licensing will make to our import dependency. We're talking about a 1 to 2% difference in our overall import dependency that new licensing creates for gas, because, as I said, we've extracted everything that we can that's cheap and easy to extract. And just on, the Climate Change Committee's projections for what our gas demand and oil demand will be in 2050. Indeed, in a net zero pathway, as we get there, we will still need domestic oil and gas. The Climate Change Committee is clear that that is not a reason to explore for more domestic production, because aside from the fact that we export most of our oil, from a climate perspective, we have hit the limit of what we can produce domestically and indeed internationally for additional oil and gas supply.
Just on that point of security of supply, which is another reason, which I think Chris was making the point about everything, everywhere, all at once. That's a kind of a security of supply argument. We need to be able to secure our energy supplies and not be reliant on imports. Even if you get a marginal contribution from the North Sea, that is a contribution towards security of supply.
It is indeed. And, we aren't suggesting that we shut down gas fields tomorrow that are currently operating. What we're saying is that first of all, if you look at, for example, what the National Energy System Operator, who is commissioned by the government to look at very serious questions about security of supply in the UK, they say, in the short to medium term, we're in a good position. In the longer term, the only real pathway to energy security in the UK is electrification and more renewable energy. And that's because, as I said, the North Sea, in a scenario where you end up with a fair fiscal regime, not one that the industry is calling for, which is tax rates that 6 or 7 years ago made the UK the most profitable offshore basin in the world. That's simply not acceptable to the British public when gas prices are spiking. In those circumstances, there just really isn't much left at all. And it's a red herring to look to the North Sea for that additional security. Can
I go back to just something Tessa said there? The UK's gas production is 45% of the UK's gas demand. That's not a negligible contribution. And certainly on our analysis, the amount of money that the UK saved by domestic gas versus imported LNG last year was order of £2.5 billion. So again, these are not small sums of money.
Just what we're talking about, the nation's finances, it is also worth remembering that during that gas price explosion after the Russia invaded Ukraine, the price we were paying for gas imports was a meaningful effect on the nation's finances. In fact, the ONS, I think it was over 2 or 3 months, we were spending about £10 billion a month to import gas. And that's a meaningful hit to the balance of payments, isn't it?
Yes, because the UK already the UK is avoiding something like £1 billion a month of fuel bill that it would otherwise be paying if the North Sea wasn't there.
Chris, can we move on slightly and just discuss a bit about the windfall tax, just how that works at the moment?
The standard rate of corporate tax in the UK is 25%. The windfall tax makes the total rate of tax on the UK North Sea 78%. And those are under conditions of where windfall is defined by the government and as being the price above which this tax is in place. And that price is currently about 60 pence a therm for gas and about $70 a barrel for oil. And if the price is above either of those, then the windfall tax is levied.
Chris, what would happen, because you talk to these companies all the time, what would happen to activity in the North Sea if the windfall tax was eliminated and new licenses were opened up, we were allowed to drill? Because in the company results, which have happened by coincidence this week, nearly all the chief executives had said, listen, we'd like to do more in the North Sea, but we're limited by taxation, not by geology. They're quite ambitious about the North Sea and prospects, but they're not going to do it as long as the tax is high.
An important point to make is that tax is one of the costs the industry has to pay. In fact, it's the largest cost globally the oil and gas industry pays, because it's the rent, the economic rent to the resource owner, whether it's the UK government or the Norwegian government or the US government in the Gulf of Mexico. Tax is the biggest single cost the oil industry pays globally. Key point to understand: companies always do the economics after tax. It's not like paying tax is optional. It's part of your cost. As I've said, it's part of your costs. So what matters is having if you want to produce oil and gas profitably, the tax rate has to be right. And what the companies are saying is, yes, there are things that we could do, but because our costs are high, and for example, 78% tax is the same tax rate as Norway, but the costs in the UK are twice, a bit more than twice what Norway's are, then that's what makes these developments uneconomic. It's also worth pointing out that the resource accounts published by DESNZ, the UK Department for Energy Security, says there's, on the current trajectory, there's going to be about 3 billion barrels, as we said earlier, 3 billion barrels of oil and gas produced by now to 2050. There's another 3 to 4 billion already discovered. So this doesn't need exploration, it's already discovered in the basin that could be exploited. And the question is, what are the economics stopping that? And with the right tax regime, that's additional energy resource that, as we said earlier, can contribute to energy security, contribute tax, significant tax revenues for the UK, as well as support jobs and energy security, which is the thing top of mind at the moment. Remember, North Sea paid just over just direct taxes from the North Sea alone were over £4 billion last year, and over £16 billion in the 2 years before that.
And Tessa, can I get your perspective on that then? So we've talked about the economic benefits to the UK. Do you think those benefits are always outweighed by the environmental impact?
Well, actually, I would, dispute the size of the economic benefits that are being claimed. What we're hearing is that the industry is prepared to move ahead with new investment in the basin on the understanding that the windfall tax is removed or that tax rates overall are lowered. Now, the windfall tax was introduced in 2022 to protect households from the fact that these companies were making unearned profits effectively, expending the same amount of effort but getting historic levels of profit because of the supply squeeze on gas. And at the same time, the wholesale gas price in the UK went up tenfold, and people's household, millions of people were pushed into fuel poverty across the UK as a result of the increase in gas prices. And so there was a public outcry and a demand that the profits, again, windfall profits that were being made by the industry, be redistributed to support households. And that's what the government partly did with the income that it received from the windfall tax. So
that just goes into the general coffers of government. There's no evidence that they actually use that money to do anything around the energy price cap or anything like that.
Well, I mean, that was certainly the rhetoric around the rhetoric. But to your point, Dominic, I mean, there is absolutely, as you say, the tax isn't hypothecated. There's no guarantee that the tax will be used to support households. But the unfairness on the face of it that companies are making historic profits while people are struggling to pay their energy bills. They don't
subsidise North Sea companies when they're making a loss. So why should they be bothered about them when they're making a profit?
Well, actually, if you look at the tax breaks that the UK government gives, the enormous rebates around decommissioning, for example, that the government has given ever since 2015 when the tax regime was changed, following a drop in the oil price and huge demand from the industry. Actually, the UK government covers, for example, 40% of decommissioning costs. Shell paid negative amounts of tax in the UK in 2021 and 2022. There have been years in the last 10 years when the overall tax take from the basin has been negative because we've paid out more in rebates than we've gotten in income. So that is why we have to accept that because of the age of the basin, because we have, unlike Norway, allowed companies to extract huge amounts at their own pace in recent decades, rather than managing a smoother decline of the basin, that now the fiscal regime is really determinative of whether or not it's profitable for these companies to drill. And they insist that they get tax breaks that, despite this being a national non-renewable resource, allows them to continue to profit when people are really suffering with their energy bills.
Well, just to follow up on that, why is North Sea gas bad, imported gas good?
I think this is the dichotomy that we're challenging. We're saying that it's not a matter of choosing between domestic gas and imported gas. It's a choice between, for example, imported gas and domestic renewables, which are what is displacing gas imports at the moment. But also, I think that the conversation is really about gas in the UK, and that's understandable given gas price spikes are what's caused so much pain in recent years. As I said, the industry itself acknowledges that even with a policy of maximum economic recovery of oil and gas, we're in a position where we're mostly reliant on gas imports already, despite everything we've done to support productivity in the basin. What's mostly left at this point is oil, and that is oil for export. 80% of our oil is exported. We don't have the refinery capacity to process those oils. If that's what you're really looking at in terms of what the North Sea basin has to offer, it's a conversation about oil, and that's quite a different one, I would say.
Can we throw it forward slightly? So coming to you, Chris, sure. Obviously we've got decisions on Rosebank and Jackdaw potentially within a matter of days, weeks. What do you think Ed Miliband is going to decide based upon the current circumstances?
I think it highly likely ends up approving both those projects. And to be clear, just to fill in some background here, Rosebank is a majority an oil project, Jackdaw is a gas project. And the reason these have become such as the public face of the North Sea is because they were the two developments challenged in 2025, and the Supreme Court said you need to oil companies, in this case Equinor for Rosebank and Shell for Jackdaw as the main developers, you have to resubmit your environmental approvals to include what's called Scope 3 emissions, and Scope 3 includes the emissions from actually burning the oil and gas that's produced from those fields, and they have to those submissions then have to be part of the Secretary of State's decision-making process, and that was what was challenged. So I suspect, yes, we do see approval of those projects coming. We'll see what happens.
If Ed Miliband does give the go-ahead, as I understand it, that doesn't then protect them from further legal challenges because it's a new approval because they've reapplied, and then so actually we could be going around the court thing again, couldn't we? I think.
Yes, we could. Yeah, yes, we could be. So the question is then, as it were, what happens? What happens next? Yeah. Does the North Sea end up in this sort of legal no man's land? Because I think one thing that would be helpful is a clear legal framework around decision-making process, because any sort of uncertainty is uncertainty at the moment in the world. Just on the world stage, uncertainty is bad for business, not just North Sea, but for everyone.
Tessa, what do you think Ed Miliband will do? And do you agree with what Chris has said, that he's likely to approve them? And if so, why?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't have any special insights into Ed Miliband's.
I should say I don't either. So making that very clear.
I think as Chris said, the government, in making a fresh decision on both of these fields, has to, for the first time, take into account the full climate impact of burning all of the oil and gas in both of these projects. And, for Rosebank, for example, which is the UK's largest undeveloped oil field, 500 million barrels of oil extracted over the course of its potential lifetime. That's the equivalent CO2 emissions to the 28 lowest income countries in the world produce in a year. That's a pretty significant climate impact, as I said, at a time when the science has made it very clear that we can't afford to have these big new developments given internationally agreed climate goals. So it's difficult to see how you could reconcile that with a robust environmental assessment. And as I said, I think Rosebank is an oil field, mostly for export, that would receive significant tax breaks. Some analysis we did showed that actually Rosebank would lead to a net tax loss for the Treasury over the course of its lifetime because of the significant investment allowances it receives in the coming years, that it's really not a good proposition for the British public. And so I think it'd be perfectly reasonable for Ed Miliband to reject.
Well, listen, thank you both very much. I'm not sure we've resolved the future of the North Sea, but at least we did air the argument. So thank you very much to Tessa Kahn from Uplift and Chris Wheaton, energy analyst at Stifel. I'm Dominic O'Connell, columnist at The Times and business correspondent on Times Radio.
And I'm Emma Powell, business journalist with The Times.
From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Business. If you enjoyed this interview, you can subscribe to The Times Business channel on YouTube, and you can watch or listen to other episodes of The Business wherever you get your podcasts. If you've got any thoughts on subjects you'd like us to tackle, or any feedback at all for that matter, do email us on thebusiness@thetimes.com. We'll be back next week. Until then, cheerio.